Scary Good. Welcome to the Scary Good NYC channel. We've got 6 scary Dogman stories over 1 hour. 3 told by Henry Lee Dogman, and 1 each by Captain Thinkmo, Madeline Starr, and yours truly. Why don't I kick things off with a story we like to call, I Think Dogman Can Control the Weather. As told to Peter Bernard, read to you by your old pal Bigfoot. You know what? I think Dogman can control the weather. Why do I think this? Well, I'll tell you. This past summer, I stayed out in the country with my Aunt Sylvia. I would mostly color and play with my surface and stuff in her living room. It had a lot of chairs, and a couch, and a rug, and a fireplace, and lots of windows so you could see out 3 different ways. Each way looked at a different part of the forest behind the estate, and the way you couldn't see was the long front driveway. Aunt Sylvia is our rich relative, but she doesn't have any kids of her own, so sometimes my parents leave me off out there. She doesn't seem to find me as annoying as they do. Anyway, sometimes Aunt Sylvia would go into town, leaving me alone in the big old house. Actually, the cook would have been there in the kitchen, but I had the rest of the place to myself. And as I said before, I would generally just be in the living room playing or coloring. Now, sometimes the room would suddenly get dark. It was summer, so there were these sudden summer storms that would come and usually be over in a half hour. It would rain really hard while it was going on though, including lightning and thunder and all the extras thrown in for free. It could get kind of frightening as the entire house would shake from some of the thunder, and you knew it was touching ground pretty close to there. So anyway, my aunt left instructions that when it started to rain, if she wasn't home, I was to run around making sure the windows were shut, and if not, to shut them. She didn't want the rain coming in and flooding the place or whatever. The first time it got dark, I got up and did my chore closing windows. When I got to this one particular window, though, I saw a shadowy figure on the other side of the drapes. It looked like someone was standing there. Those windows were still open, but I was too afraid that if I went close enough to close them, whatever was on the other side could reach in and grab me. Still, I couldn't be sure it wasn't an optical illusion and I would get in trouble if I didn't close the windows, so I decided to turn on the room light and see for certain what was on the other side of those drapes. I remember telling myself that I was 2 seconds from not being scared anymore. I turned on the light, turned around to see what was out the window, and I proceeded to scream. I screamed unnaturally loud, and I screamed unnaturally long. I ran upstairs unnaturally fast, and slammed my bedroom door unnaturally hard. I called my aunt unnaturally quickly and screamed at her unnaturally illegibly. There was a werewolf outside that window. It was a tall man, over 6 feet. It was hairy, and the hair was dripping wet. It had long, tall ears, almost like rabbit ears. It had long, sharp-looking fangs, and it seemed very angry. I told all this on the phone to my aunt, who thought I was incredibly imaginative and humorous. I didn't get in trouble for leaving the window open, but that didn't mean she believed my story. Nevertheless, it kept happening, and it would always happen the same way. My aunt would leave for town, the sky would get dark, I'd close windows and then find the Dogman staring in from a different window each time. It got so that I would close all the windows as she was leaving, then spend the rest of the time locked in my room till she got back. This always made Aunt Sylvia giggle, but she humored me anyway. One time, I was locked in my room and the rains came. I looked out of my window and I saw the Dogman standing below, looking into one of the living room windows. As though he heard me thinking about him, he turned his head suddenly upward and looked right at me. I screamed and hid under the bed until I heard my aunt come home later on. And so it went all summer. On the trip back home, it dawned on me that I probably should have just gone into town with Aunt Sylvia. It probably would have saved me a lot of stress. But then, I wouldn't have found out that Dogman can control the weather. Dear Scary Good NYC, I was born in Dutchess County, New York, and grew up in Poughkeepsie. My grandfather was the first of our family to move to that area, but the way he talked about it, we had always been there and always would be. He even had his and Grandma's plots already bought and reserved for them in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. Sometimes on warm sunny Sundays, we would drive out to the cemetery, just me and Grandpa. We'd walk through the place together, reading tombstones. We started to become familiar with certain of them. If you walk long enough, eventually you get to a small lake, or maybe it's a pond. There's a kind of an island in there, and one Sunday, after my grandfather fell asleep under a tree, I took off my shoes and waded out to the island. I was playing around and having fun when I heard someone calling me. It wasn't my grandfather's voice, and I reacted with a start. I slipped off a rock I was standing on and fell backward in the water. But it was deep enough that my head was fully submerged when the wind got knocked out of me, and I accidentally inhaled water. If you've ever had something like that happen to you, then you know how painful and uncomfortable it can be. I was struggling to get up and get the water out of my lungs, and I must have been flailing about. Somebody pulled me out of the water and threw me to the ground. Then they started pushing on me to get the water out of my lungs. These were the days before they would breathe into your mouth and all that stuff. The guy was banging on me, but he got me up and functioning again. It was a pretty scary experience, so I was shaken up and crying. I have no idea who the guy was, but apparently he and Grandpa had found me together. I guess when he woke up and I wasn't around, he enlisted the help of this stranger in locating me. So when I got home, I got yelled at by my mother that I had made a nice gentleman ruin his good Sunday suit just because I wanted to play on an island. Mom forbade Grandpa from ever bringing me back to that cemetery. He disagreed with her decision right in front of me, but he always honored her wishes and never brought me back. Fast forward years later, I was in my teens and running with a fairly tough crowd, at least by my standards. I was kind of a goody two-shoes growing up, and I suppose I mostly have been in adulthood as well, but this was my one rebellious period. So, one night the guys wanted to play with the Ouija board and I laughed because I thought this was a game for girls. I got belted hard for saying that because the toughest guy in our group, let's call him Guido, which was not his real name. Guido was the guy who brought the board over. Anyway, we got to playing. Actually, I was just watching, but two of the guys were using it and we were all having this conversation. There was an entity named Emo, which is a funny name these days, but didn't really mean anything to us back in the day. So, Emo claimed to not be a dead person, but an earth spirit. He said he had been here since before people, and he would be here long after us too. One of the guys asked Emo if we could see him, if he could prove to us that he was real and not just one of the guys faking the Ouija board. Emo responded that we should go to the pond in the cemetery right away, and he would prove it to us. That really freaked me out. Even though it had been years, I had never gone back to that pond. Being banned from somewhere kind of affects your view of it. I was terrified by the idea of going back there at all, but especially at night. Still, what place could possibly be more rebellious to visit? I was all about breaking my parents' rules back at that point, so I figured this might be a way to have some spooky fun and disobey authority all at the same time. Since I remembered the layout of the place pretty well, I even had an idea for the best way we could sneak in. If we parked the car in a lot by one of the hotels, we could cross back over the highway and sneak into the woods between some of the private homes over there. Behind them is just woods and woods and woods for a really long way. If we hugged the edge of the tree line and stayed hidden under the cover of the trees, we should be able to come around and be on the north side of the pond. Everyone agreed, and off we went. I think there were 5 of us. Whoever was driving started to get cold feet as we approached the area. He noted how creepy the forest looked at night and suggested we abandon this plan and go do something safer, like playing baseball with people's mailboxes. We agreed to let him stay in the car and wait for us. This way, if we needed to get out of there in a hurry, we'd have him starting the engine for us as we ran up. We imagined it all very dramatic, like in the movies. Chased from the forest by a nature spirit. What did a nature spirit look like? Who knew? So, if you've ever walked into a forest alongside a highway at night, you've probably noticed the same thing that we noticed that night. It's really dark. You are going to trip over things, and some of them might bite you for doing it. We had voted and decided no flashlights since they would give us away and probably get us in trouble. But right then, I think we all would have voted the opposite way if we had another option. There were no cell phones in those days, obviously. It was just us. We were alone. We were out in the forest because the Ouija board had told us to do it. I was pretty sure I heard something in the woods off to our left following us. I kept whispering to the others about what I thought I was hearing, but they wouldn't shut up long enough to listen for themselves. Our goal was on the right, and either something was stalking us to our left, or there was an echo of our own sounds from that direction. I was terrified, and although the others were acting tough, I'm pretty sure none of us would have come if we knew it was going to be this creepy. After all, if someone or something offed us out there, how many years would it be before anyone found out about it? I am not one of those people who are terrified of Ouija boards, but I would say I decided then and there never to take the advice of one ever again. Someone saw eye shine, and we all stopped dead in our tracks. Whatever that thing was, it had to be over 12 feet tall. Now I suggested we go home. I was asked why. I said, why? We came here to see an earth spirit, and that 12-foot tall thing must be one, so let's please go home before I poop myself. Guido, remember he's the largest one, he took a step toward that thing. Cautiously, he followed his first step with a second and a third. After he slowly advanced about a dozen steps, Guido laughed quietly to himself. We all wondered what was so funny. Bending down, he picked up a small rock and heaved it in the direction of the eyes. The rock hit close to its mark, and the eyes rose up into the air, even further, straight up into the trees, where they disappeared. We all gasped in shock, not able to believe what we had just witnessed. Guido walked back, pointing at us and laughing his butt off. "It was an owl, you idiots!" He had a lot of fun at our expense. It was an owl that had been sitting on a branch about 11 feet off the ground, and it was not a 12-foot tall nature spirit. This served to make us all a little bit less frightened to be there. After all, a forest was a forest was a forest. This was just one that wasn't very well lit, that was all, nothing to be afraid of. We marched on, feeling much more confident, and sure enough, my plan worked. We were able to cut through the trees and come out on the north side of the pond, where we were almost certain we could make out a figure standing on the small island to the south of the water. This was the first time I was seeing the place since my accident, and fear was shooting through me like electric icicles. I looked at the figure on the island, trying to see if it might be a tree trunk or if it really was a human form. The thing moved to the side, and briefly I could make out the silhouette of it in profile. It had animal legs. I choked on my own breath. I was that surprised. It definitely had noticed us as it walked bipedally toward our end of its little island, and it peered out at us. "That's a dog!" shouted one of my friends. "Dogs don't stand up, that's a man!" someone else shouted back. Then the figure on the island did something, as if in answer to our confusion. That thing howled. It looked like Lon Chaney Jr. standing there in the moonlight, but now we could see its face was more like that of a dog or a bear than that of a man. But its legs were dog or wolf-like, not bear-like, and bears don't howl. We were all freaking out and talking over each other, trying to decide what that was and if we should go closer. Then, once again, whatever that thing was decided for us what would happen next. It dove into the water and started swimming directly toward us in this kind of sick-looking mega doggy paddle. The thing moved through the water like a shark, and it was already halfway across toward us before we started running away. We ran through those woods screaming and crying like little children. We didn't feel so tough anymore. At least one of my friends was crying for his mommy, and that's no lie. I don't think any of us thought we were going to get away. Seeing the lights of the highway and the hotel parking lot across it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. We ran out onto the road and nearly got taken down by a tractor trailer. None of us were, though, and we just kept scrambling until we were in that car and driving home. I have no idea what that thing that swam after us was, but it had a dog head. It stood up, and it howled. So you tell me what it was. Was it a nature spirit? Is that what people are seeing when they see Dogman? Was it a trick set up by one of my two friends who were playing with the Ouija that night? If so, how did they set it up in the dark in a forest back in the days before cell phones? If that really was someone in a costume set up on the island to spook us, how could he swim while wearing a Dogman costume? Of course, I'm afraid of that place. I was even before that night, so I might have been misinterpreting details due to my inherent fear and phobia of the location. That doesn't, however, explain that all my buddies experienced the same thing that I did. Obviously, I've never returned to that pond. Even looking at satellite imagery of it from Google Earth sends chills up my spine. But as for the Ouija, since the Ouija had been right, and we really had seen something weird exactly where it told us that we would, we started using the board several times a week. I never believed anything it said, but my buddies would literally spend money on its answers. We asked it to predict horse races for us. We asked it what the weather was going to be. It would get a lot of things wrong, and we would be about to give up on it. Then it would get something right exactly once again, and we would be hooked all over again. After a while, I got the feeling that the Ouija really did have all or most of the answers, but that it would only share the information with you if it would be to its own benefit. Ultimately, it's not going to lead you anywhere good. And so we all moved on to other things, and I've forgotten almost all that passed between me and those guys. But one thing I'll never forget, till the day I die, is the Dutchess County Dogman. Hump Day Houndman of the Hollywood Hills. Dear Daily Dogman, I know you like stories about werewolf sightings that happen on Wednesdays, and that is something that actually happened to me. This story took place a few years back, or maybe more like 6 actually. Time flies. I was living in Los Angeles near Hollywood with my then girlfriend. Let's call her Anita, which was not her real name. She and I lived together almost 2 years. We were both trying to create careers for ourselves in Hollywood, and both living far beyond our means. We partied nearly every night, but it was mainly to make contacts and get someplace, and we viewed it as part of our job. Well, if it would have ever started paying enough, then it would have been part of our job. We started to get to know some cool artists and successful executives, but only socially. We weren't making any breakthroughs to getting gigs, but we kept getting invited back to parties. One evening, while driving along, heading home to prepare to go out, we saw what can only be described as a dogman or werewolf just walk out onto the road in front of us. Anita was driving and she screeched on the brakes immediately, stopping us well short of the animal or man in a suit or whatever it was. It looked too big to be a man in a costume, and the legs bent backwards like a dog's hind legs. The head was that of an immense, prehistoric-looking, tall-eared wolf or dog, and it stood on top of massive, muscular shoulders. The thing is, as we watched it walk in front of us, it was right at sunset, and we could literally see the Hollywood sign up on the hills behind him. It would have made quite a photograph if we had a professional with us. The thing never looked in our direction, and then it disappeared into the brush, and that was the end of the sighting. So we sat there for a few seconds, then traffic started beeping at us from behind, so Anita hit the gas, and we sped off in silence, trying to grasp what we had just seen. A werewolf walking in front of the Hollywood sign? That had to be a publicity stunt. We now had a story to tell at the party. Nobody there knew about any upcoming werewolf movies, but we all agreed that when this one came out, we wanted to see it. The monster looked very real, especially around the head, and it was all live effects, no CGI. I couldn't figure out how they did some parts of it, like the legs, but I had no doubt that it had been a publicity prank. After all, this was Hollywood. One of the people at the party said it must have been related to a John Landis picture, because we saw it on a Wednesday. Apparently he has a thing about Wednesdays, according to this guy. I don't know if that's really true, but we were all braced for a new John Landis werewolf picture, and it never came out. So, about a month or 2 later, maybe 3 months, I don't remember, Anita was driving us home from a party, and one of the tires blew. Now, we lived out near Hollywood, like I said, and we partied with the rich and famous, but we ourselves couldn't afford AAA or anything like that. We had one spare tire. It was rather suspect, and I was going to have to manually change the flat right now, in the middle of the night, in the dark, on the side of the highway. So that was what I did. I banged one of my fingers and one of my knees. I did a terrible job at first, and it took me quite a while before I was able to get the old tire off and the quote-unquote new one on. The entire time I was working, I felt like someone was watching me, but I brushed it off. As I was tightening everything all over and making sure the wheel was really on correctly, I heard a sound in the trees alongside the road. I didn't get up, and I didn't look. I just worked harder and faster. When I was done, I grabbed the tools and stood up. I was ready to bang whoever it was on the head if they got too close to me. But I saw nobody. I walked to the car trunk, which I had left open. Still, nobody and nothing out of the ordinary. I tossed the tools inside and closed the hood. As I did so, 2 glowing yellow-red eyes came into my field of vision. I heard a growl, and then my knees buckled as I saw the form of that same werewolf we had seen before walked out at me. It was looking right at me with such utter hatred, and there's no way that was a mask I was seeing. It was a genuine, real-life animal, but it was also a man. It reached out for me, and I could see it had hands the size of my chest, and they ended with long claws. I did what any brave man would do. I got in the back seat from the roadside of the car, keeping as much distance between myself and that monster as possible, and squeaked out a little, "Please drive now," to my girlfriend Anita. The Dogman banged on the back of the car, and Anita screamed, then drove out of there. It actually pursued us for some time as I stared out the back window, unbelieving. Although I wasn't watching the speedometer in the car, I'm pretty sure that thing ran faster than any man has ever run. No man in a costume could have possibly kept up with that thing. When enough relief had set in that we could joke around about what had just happened, I said that our friend with the John Landis theory was going to be disappointed. After all, this encounter took place on Tuesday, not Wednesday. Anita held up her cell phone, and I didn't get her point at first. She pointed out the time, and I was like, "Okay, it's 1:30 a.m. What's your point?" "My point," she answered me, "is that it's been Wednesday now for a good hour and a half."
Small Town Dogman, as told to Peter Bernard, read by Madeline Starr. We received the following Dogman sightings from one of our listeners, who begins with this note. These are all my true encounters taking place in 2010, 2011, and 2014. All of them occurred around the same part of town. I'd prefer to remain anonymous. Encounter 1. Early September 2010. I, like thousands, or I guess millions of others, had gone back for yet another year of prison. I mean torture. I mean school. Yay! I didn't really enjoy school much anymore since someone who was easily twice my size took it upon himself to make my life miserable. Let's just say I was pretty shaken up at the time. Even after school, I was still fretting about school. So when I got home, miserable, my mom sent me out to get some sandwich supplies to tide us over until she could go shopping that weekend. Where I'm from, it's practically the country. Food shopping is a big event that you plan ahead for and have to drive miles and miles in either direction to accomplish. It's a different life than you city dwellers have, with your 24-hour supermarkets on every other corner. To get temporary supplies to tide you over, there is a local store, but we define local differently than city folk. So I had to walk past some woods, some houses, and this one patch of undeveloped land with all sorts of animals always going into and out of it. I was actually glad to get out of the house. The walk was only like 15 minutes each way, and I'd get a free soda out of it, so It beat sitting home and worrying about how bad the next day was going to be at school. As I walked, I noticed the streets, which were usually filled with children and dogs, were dead silent. I tried to shrug it off, making excuses in my mind. Maybe it was because school had just restarted. I noticed things were weird, but it wasn't like I had a strange or ominous feeling. It wasn't like the vibrations changed. Instead, I made excuses why this might be normal and kept on my path. I got to the store, picked up what I was sent for, plus my soda, then got drawn into a conversation with the lady who worked there. She and I knew each other for a while, and she's a nice person and all, but I was still a little too shaken up by school to feel normal enough to just chat with an acquaintance. I cut the conversation short as politely as I could manage and left for home. Now, let me try to explain the layout here. I had 2 choices to get home. Or 3, sort of. There's the one straight road that has houses on either side and goes closest to my house. Then there are the other 2 roads which almost leave me off the same place, but which are not as well lit. Those 2 roads are on either side of this extended, undeveloped mess of an area, or at least they were back in those days. Back then, it was thickly overgrown and served as shelter for stray animals, rodents, birds, as well as a hiding spot for kids who smoked. I always walked straight when alone, because that way is better lit thanks to the houses. Except, for some reason, on this particular evening, I noticed how dark it had become, then realized that for some reason I had chosen the road home past the overgrown rat's nest place. I really could have gone back to the store and started over. It probably would have cost me 5 minutes, but I just didn't for whatever reason. The overdeveloped field was dark, and only had one street lamp on either side for its entire stretch. The one on my side was dim and flickering on this particular occasion. I would learn over time that the lamp was always dim at best, sometimes not working at all. This went on for years with no repair, but I guess most people weren't dumb enough to walk past it in the dark like I was about to do. So it wasn't really a problem for very many people. I myself had only ridden in a car past here at night before, and it had never seemed scary, but walking past it sure gave me the creeps. I watched the ground in the darkness in case mice, or worse, ran out toward my feet. I was walking not on the dirt sidewalk, but on the paved road itself, in order to give myself some distance from the nasty woods. That road had potholes large and deep enough to wreck cars if hit at the right or wrong speed or angle. So I wasn't just watching for rodents, I was watching that I didn't twist my ankle on the rough street, as well as keeping an eye out that some car didn't accidentally swerve off the road and knock me down. The only good thing about all this was that at least I wasn't thinking about school for a few minutes. But I certainly wasn't any more relaxed. After the day I had, I was a bit paranoid, certain that something bad was going to happen at any moment. Suddenly, my expectations were fulfilled, as there was movement in the field next to me. I turned, expecting the usual cat or something. It was breeding season still, so seeing a cat hunting or carrying kittens was expected. Instead, I saw a head roughly the size of a grizzly. Maybe larger, with thick fur, black as the bottom of the ocean. It had large, pointy ears, a long snout with giant teeth set against gums that looked pitch black, at least in that light. I don't remember running home. I remember blinking, and the next thing I knew, I was throwing myself into my house. gasping desperately for air, slamming and locking the door behind me. I told my parents I had seen a giant black dog and it had charged me. My folks were surprised because anybody who knows me knows that I'd be the one to befriend wild animals if I had the chance. Everyone knows I fear no canines. My mom assured me that it was likely a stray or escaped dog that had been abused and it just wanted the meat I had bought. She seemed pretty certain that she was right, and she was my mother after all, so I did what anybody would do. Believed it. Encounter 2. This was just after the new year that same school year. So either late December 2010 or early January 2011. I had decided to go for a walk around 8:30 or 9. I wasn't usually allowed out alone that late, but seeing as it was Christmas break, my folks agreed as long as I was careful about watching the roads for drunk drivers and whatnot. You know, the usual parent things. I had totally forgotten about what happened way back in the fall and was heading right down one of those streets from the last encounter. The only issue I had was that it was so cold that my iPod froze. Literally. I grumbled and placed it into my coat to heat it up and hopefully get it playing again. I decided to go to the store to spend a little of the money I had gotten for Christmas before heading home. The iPod had been in my coat for 10 or 15 minutes and still wasn't responding, and I don't like walking or doing anything without music playing. So I'm walking fairly slowly as the road is on a slight downward slope and was coated in layers of ice, slush, and wet snow. As per usual, the street lights were out, so I was relying on the lights from the houses or from passing cars in the creepily dark night. It was only when I realized that I could hear cars coming and going from a distance that I noticed how dead the night was. Holiday season or not, it's never quiet in my town at any time, and the area around the store is usually hectic at all hours. It was at that moment I saw someone standing under one of the very dim streetlights. Back to me in all black. It was too dark to make out anything other than the vague outline, which looked like a tall, bulky man. I thought he could have been wearing layers to keep out the cold. A drunk, perhaps? Maybe Arnold Schwarzenegger. Either way, I immediately got the creeps and was going to just back up the way I came and then hurry home. It was at that moment that my iPod roared to life, began blasting music at full volume, and the loudest song. Just my luck, huh? I looked again at the person and felt my blood turn cold. The man had turned his head slightly, showing that he had a long snout, and suddenly a large pointy ear unfolds and perks up. I don't remember much other than I yelped and bolted home, not slipping once out of sheer dumb luck, and by the grace of God. I didn't say much to my parents other than a weird man in all black was hanging out around the store. I knew at that point it was probably a Dogman, but I had nobody to tell and no idea what I could do about it. It wasn't like I could make a silver bullet and shoot it. Sure, if my dad saw it, he'd grab his shotgun used for hunting, and he'd blast this thing to the next county. And my dad believes in these things too, but I doubt he'd believe me if I told him I'd seen something like that. At least not around here. I've never found any proof, so I only had my word to go with. Either way, I basically never left the house again until school resumed. Encounter 3. By spring of 2014, I had totally forgotten about anything that had happened. It wasn't even in the back of my mind at that point, because each year of high school can feel like an entirely new life for you, all-consuming. I had resumed my walks as by then I was technically an adult and didn't have a curfew anymore. And to help cut down on stray animals being run over, the town clear-cut that overgrown patch of land, and I think sold it or rented it to a nearby business. But don't quote me on that last part because I'm not sure. Anyway, I had taken to walking all the streets in that area as it was uphill and various family and friends lived throughout. This was a much happier time for me than the first encounter, most definitely. Even though the area got clear-cut, there were still a whole lot of cats roaming around. I think maybe they had been left behind deliberately to keep the rodent population down, but maybe they were just too hard to catch. I had gotten into the habit of stopping to pet the wandering cats, be they stray or otherwise. I'm an animal lover, obviously. This night was one of those nights, and I was kneeling on the ground, surrounded by cats, petting them as much as I could. Nothing felt like it was off, and it felt like a normal night, but when a particularly tough, battle-scarred cat that didn't shy away from anything or one suddenly yowled and bolted like it was on fire, I jumped to my feet, sending the rest of the cats running. I looked around for anything that could have scared the cat. I was thinking that someone had blasted one of those high-frequency sounds only cats can hear. But then why would only the one cat have become frightened? He had been in the middle of the road and closer to the houses than the others. Then sitting just out of the light of a back porch, I noticed what it must have been that frightened the cat. On the porch, in the dark, I could see the silhouette of a very, very large dog. I let my eyes adjust to the light, and I slowly made out more and more detail. It was shaggy and dark, but parts of it were lighter and seemed gray. It looked like an Irish wolfhound around its face and chin, but sort of crossed with an Alaskan Malamute type of dog, in the sense that its ears were triangular and stood on top of its head. I stared at it, not totally scared, but not all too comfortable either. Like I said before, I befriend wild animals when I can, and I fear no canines. In fact, I'm looking into legally owning wolves, coyotes, and dingoes one day. I didn't recognize this dog, but figured it was a new resident or rescue. Another possibility, since it was around Easter, was that someone was visiting and brought their family dog with them. In the dark, I could see the animal rise to all fours. It was truly a massive creature, unnervingly large. I watched as it started slowly and awkwardly coming towards me. It was a stiff movement, like it was difficult. Not surprising, as it looked like an elderly dog that might have arthritis. Maybe it was gray-haired due to age? However, that idea went right out the window when it came into the light of the house, and I realized that it had hands and was crawling like a person. I noped out of there and bolted home. My grandmother could have been running behind me and I wouldn't have stopped or slowed down. That was the most scared I had ever been. It put anything that had ever happened to me before to shame. I looked behind me, expecting to see its face snarling inches away, expecting to smell its horrible breath. I looked, and I saw nothing. I thought about ringing the bells of my friends who live over there just to warn them. They have kids and pets. That might be why this thing was hanging around. In fact, one of the people over there runs a mini farm, which very well could have been this thing's food source. I was too scared to go back the way I came, though. That would be tempting fate. Besides, how would people react exactly if I went door to door warning of a werewolf attack? I mean, I was a senior now. That would send me back to the status of the weirdo freshman. So, feeling very guilty, I walked home and didn't tell anyone what happened. I've never seen it since, and I pray I never do again. I don't go out at night all that much, and when I do, I avoid those roads as much as possible. But it's always in the back of my mind that it could show up again, so I don't think I'll ever stop keeping an eye out for it. I've since cleansed my home to ward off bad energies, and I like to believe that helps in some way. Though I'm confused that somehow, despite showing up in a populated place, I'm the only one who has seen it. I'm just glad that I'm not the only one who has seen something like this in general, and I thank you all for taking the time to listen to these stories from my younger days.
Dogman's 60th anniversary, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. 60 years ago this year, I think I might have seen a wolfman or a dogman. I was 14 years old at the time, so do the math, I'm an old man now. But back then, I was the eldest son in a family of 3 brothers and 2 sisters, plus mom and dad and my grandmother on my mother's side, all in one 2-story house. We lived out in the country in Georgia, and we were finally getting internal plumbing put into the house, a sign of prosperity to be sure. I was very excited to know that my outhouse days would be drawing to a close, until my father informed me that it would be my job to dig the ditch to put the septic tank into. Of course, he picked the hottest day in my life up to that point to make me dig. It had to be over 100 degrees and the area had no shade, so the sun was beating down on me. I felt like I was on fire. I don't think I even got 3 feet down into the ground and I already felt like I was gonna die. I rested for a while and my father came over to yell at me. I begged him to let me do the job at night, but he was having none of it. Fathers were strict people in those days, and it wasn't like he was any stricter than any of the others. I just lay there for a while longer, panting. I couldn't even understand what my father was saying to me anymore. I was so tired. He seemed to go away, and I was just about to drift off into sleep and dreamland when crash! Water came splashing down all over me. My father had doused me with a bucket of cold water. "The next time I'll use something other than water if I catch you out here loafing again," he warned. Then he stamped back into the house. The water cooled me down significantly for a while and I got back to work. The job seemed done to me after I had the hole now covering my head. I climbed back out using the rope I had tied to a tree and I wanted to go tell my father the job was done, but I literally could not get up. I needed a rest so badly, and I lay there in the sun. I wanted to at least crawl over to the tree and get some shade, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like it had gone on strike. I managed to roll over onto my back and now I was staring up into the blazing sky. It was like being in a clay oven or something. I knew I had to get up or my father was going to dump something really disgusting on top of me. It might take days to get the smell off me. I desperately needed to get back on my feet before he punished me. I sat out briefly and the world literally spun around. I remember laying sideways with my head on the ground, unsure how I had gotten back down there. I must have blacked out for a minute. So now my mind was intact and I could see, but my body was really in the process of rebooting and hadn't come back online yet. I had no choice but to wait until I had the strength to get up. I had to be patient, so I decided to accept the worst. I might get something dumped on me. So what? If I still didn't move after he dumped me, even my father would realize he'd gone too far in his punishments and I would be forgiven. I was doing the best I could in the moment, and I had to trust that eventually I would be forgiven for this quote-unquote laziness, which was actually physical exhaustion, and probably dehydration and who knows what else as well. So I lay there, grass in my face, staring over at the woods in front of me because that was literally the only direction I could look until I regained the ability to sit up or stand. I noticed the breeze blowing the leaves on the trees and bushes and it relaxed me. A feeling like what I would later call Zen swept over me. Not having any choice but to be entirely present in that moment, I felt all pain and worry wash away to the past and the future, and I realized they were illusions and confusions, but the only real thing was that moment itself. I had never felt such peace before. And then, all the peace got sucked out of the scene as I saw what could only be described as a werewolf. Walking out of the woods. Actually, I would say it ran out of the woods, but I hadn't heard it approaching. It was like it stepped out of a portal hidden just inside the trees. Now it stood in place, looking all around quickly with wild, angry eyes, snarling, grunting, and drooling from the long tongue that hung out of its mouth. It had long, tall, pointed ears and very dark fur with intricate patterns in it of slightly lighter fur. Adrenaline pumped through me and I found myself sitting up. My quick movement drew the attention of the dog, who stared right at me. Now this next part is sort of weird. It wasn't that I stopped being scared exactly, but it was more as though I overloaded so much on the fear that my mind sort of rejected it as over the top and ridiculous. Rather than run, rather than cry, rather than fighting the creature or any other semi-logical response, I started laughing. I know, it's a weird reaction. I guess it was what they sometimes call nervous laughter. All I knew is I felt a sense of relief that this couldn't possibly be happening. The world spun around me again and I laid down facing the grass looking in the direction of the Dogman. He had his head tilted to the side as though my behavior confused him. I continued to laugh and then I heard the dog growl. Well, actually I felt it in my body coming through the ground. I felt the vibration of his very, very low growl. I wondered how I could be imagining or hallucinating a vibration of a growl. I understood the idea of hallucinating visions, and I know that sounds can be projected into people's minds. The full-on vibrating my body sort of virtual reality experience I had not been familiar with the existence of. I looked at my hallucination of a werewolf and it was still there. It saw me looking at it and it made this very angry sounding noise. Then it charged me, snarling, spit flying in all directions. Real or hallucination, my entire being got its act together and every aspect of me raced toward my family's house. It was maybe 50 feet away and the Dogman was 50 feet behind me, but gaining. I felt like I was running in quicksand. It had a very dreamlike quality to it. My ears were ringing and my vision was both blurry and shifting all over the place. I could see black spots around the edges of anything I looked at and I knew I was about to black out. If I fainted before getting inside, I was going to end up lunch for that creature. I don't remember anything else until I woke up with a bad neck ache, laying in a weird position on the floor inside the back door. I must have gotten inside and locked the door then fainted. I got up slowly, every part of me aching. I felt like what I would later learn a hangover felt like. When I finally was able to stand up, I noticed that neither the screen door nor the inner door of the house had even been closed fully, let alone locked. Apparently the Dogman respected the boundaries of our door frame, which was a huge relief. I was also hugely relieved that my father had been away from the house through all this, and I went off to tell him that I'd finished the pit he wanted me to dig. From then on, I was on guard constantly against the walking dog of the forest, but I never saw the creature again. Looking back on the encounter, I have to honestly say that I would be 100% certain that I had imagined what happened due to the heat and my own dehydration and exhaustion, except for one thing. The stories that other people tell of seeing something so similar to what chased me that day. If it were a hallucination, how would other people have seen the same thing? There must be some reality behind whatever Dogman is, otherwise, so many people would not have been reporting it over so many years. What it is, I'm not qualified to even guess, but the fact that it must be, has to be, something, is probably something we should all begin to accept as a culture. At least that's my opinion, and thank you for letting me express it. How's it going, Lobes? Oh, just fine. I'm trapped in a jar on a Stone Age planet. How are you? I'm fine. Glad to hear it. I suppose I should tell the story now? Sounds good. Fine, well get off the screen and I'll... Thank you. Now I can begin. The following story is absolutely 100% true. Like all monster stories told to you by fictional cartoon characters. I mean, Who would ever doubt a brain from space floating in a jar? Nobody. That's who. All seriousness aside, I'm pretty sure this might have really happened, as the person who told it to me certainly believed every word he was saying. When he got to the scary parts, I could see him sweating. I could smell his fear. If this story isn't true, then something equally frightening must have happened to this guy, because he clearly had been traumatized. I don't want to say exactly where or when this took place, but it was in rural Pennsylvania during the 1960s, when there had been a flap of UFO and monster sightings going on for some time. I was disguised in my very friendly-looking human form, and I was going door to door, ringing bells and asking people point blank if they had seen anything strange in the area lately. I never used to ask questions any more specific than that. I might be wondering if they'd seen a UFO, but if I worded the question in a vague enough fashion, then I could sometimes get them to tell me completely unexpected stories about cryptids, strange visions, poltergeist activity, and a range of other phenomena that humans aren't advanced enough to understand yet. This fellow in particular had been experiencing nearly all of the above. Probably the first thing I should explain is where this guy lived. He was at the end of a block right near a forest. Although there were 5 other houses on his block, they all had clearly been abandoned. This was especially noticeable to me since the rest of the community seemed fairly affluent. How could this one lonely block have been hit by hard times in the midst of such prosperity? In fact, I asked the guy that very question directly, and he told me that the block was built on cursed land. His neighbors had moved because of it, but his business had been hurt by the curse, and now he couldn't afford to move. I began to wonder if the guy was a lunatic when he apologized for acting like a crazy man and invited me inside. We had a long talk, and I left there thinking that this man was definitely very stressed, and he was nearing a breaking point, but that he was also still clinging, however tenaciously, to the buttocks of sanity. In other words, he hadn't really gone crazy just yet. He told me several stories. Here are some of my personal favorites. The guy said he was in the park one day after work, trying to decompress and get in a better mood before heading home. He had a very busy day with constant conflict and things going wrong, and it had given him both a headache and a stomachache. He sat in the park, trying to clear his mind, and just listen to the birds and the sounds of people doing their thing, when something caught his attention out of the corner of his eye. It was a figure standing in the shadows of the trees off in the distance. The afternoon was still very bright, so it was hard to make out, but he was almost certain there was someone standing there in the darkness. It's probably just someone like me wanting to get back in touch with nature to get rid of a headache, he told himself, then tried to ignore whatever he sensed from that direction. As the evening came on, his headache hadn't dissipated in the slightest, and he was increasingly more certain that someone was there in the dark and that they were staring at him. It was just that feeling you get, you know? That was how he felt. Someone was watching him. The park lights came on all at once, apparently on a timer set to the sundown. When they did, he caught a glimpse of something from that same direction of the woods. Looking there more intently, He was now certain that he saw eye shine. He instinctively stood up. Humans don't give eye shine. They look like an animal, but it was an upright creature like a human. As he watched, the form moved out of the tree line, and the man found himself living inside a waking nightmare. It was the most hideous and frightening thing he had ever seen in his life, and it was actually walking out of the woods toward him, only about the length of a baseball field away. The guy looked around to see if anyone else was seeing what he was seeing, but was stunned and chilled to the bone to discover that nobody else was there at all. Looking back at the creature, he noticed, as it passed a sliding pond, that it was much taller than he thought it was. He was just imagining it as being man-sized because it was shaped like a man. The closer it got, the bigger it seemed, and that was not good. Its stride, which was identical to that of a confident man, was not in any way wild like that of an ape or a bear. He began to quicken a little more with each step. Its animal eyes held the guy as though he were hypnotized. Shaking his head to break the trance, this guy tried to look analytically at what was happening. What was that thing if not a bear, and not an ape, and too tall to be a man? It looked a lot like a dog, or a very dark breed of wolf, but neither of those stand and walk. Could it be a sloth, a prehistoric sloth? They used to stand, at least according to the displays in museums he had seen photos of. Its legs were like a devil's legs, and its arms were hairy and massive, ending in claws that looked like they could tear him to ribbons. They also looked like claws long and sturdy enough to hold the creature's weight if he hung from a limb, which added to the guy's theory that it might actually be a giant sloth coming at him. But then the creature did something that changed this fellow's mind about what he was seeing and made him no longer care what it was both at the same time. That creature got low to the ground, bared its teeth, and then that thing barked at him angrily. It was kind of a growl and a bark at the same time, and all the guy could think was, "This is a werewolf." The creature broke into a run, and so did the fellow in question. He had to get out of the park before that thing caught up to him, and its legs were longer than his. Getting to the entrance, he saw that the park had been closed, and he had never noticed. No wonder there was no one else around. He was chained in, and would have to climb over the fence. Reaching up and climbing over, he could see the creature now on all fours, running toward him. He only had a few seconds to get over that fence, and he flung his body over the top like a crazy person, landing on top of the fence hard on his belly. With the wind knocked out of him, the guy's back half was over the fence and his front half was turned around, facing the monster which was closing in, and took a leap right at the guy's face. Falling backward and landing hard, the guy staggered to his feet, down the block, away from the monster, walking out into traffic without meaning to. Looking behind, he saw the werewolf thing clear the fence on his second try. Facing front again, the guy saw a car directly in front of him and flagged it down. He was very out of breath, but tried to explain to the driver that there was a werewolf. Clearly frightened by the guy's disheveled appearance and manic behavior, the driver stared at him in horror, then drove on, running straight into the werewolf without even seeing where he was driving, then slamming on his brakes. The guy took this chance to run. Now the monster was that driver's problem. It was a selfish decision, but the guy was genuinely afraid for his life, so he ran like a coward. When he got home, He told me he collapsed onto the couch and cried from the stress, but at least he was home, and at least he was safe. He went into his pantry to get something for dinner, and there, standing in the small room, going through his cereal cabinet as though looking for something, was the 7-foot-tall Dogman from the park. The guy says he screamed and then the Dogman vanished into thin air. He woke up later on the kitchen floor. He figures he must have fainted when he saw the Dogman in his home. Since then, they appear to him in his bedroom at night. They walk into the room while he's watching TV. They never leave him alone. They've never touched him, but they don't really have to. Sooner or later, the stress from their presence was going to either kill him or drive him crazy. Sooner or later, they would win. If he could only get his revenue up in the next quarter, he could afford a small apartment in town. If he could have operated his business from a rooming house, he'd have moved out already. The guy told me that one time, he was showering in the morning and had fogged up the mirror in his bathroom. Rubbing the fog off the mirror, he saw the reflection of a Dogman standing right behind him. Turning around in horror, there was nothing there. Looking back in the mirror, he saw nothing there either. Then he discovered that by altering the angle he looked in the mirror, from some angles, he could actually see the creature behind him, and from other angles it would disappear. But he couldn't feel it. When he felt in the area and he didn't smell it or sense heat or cold off it, so he wasn't sure if it was actually there or not. He decided to shave at his desk instead of the bathroom that day. I asked him if he could further explain why he had said the land was cursed, and he told me it was a Native American curse. When I asked where he had found this information, he told me he had learned it from one of the other neighbors who told him that's why they were moving out. Supposedly, the neighbor had in turn heard it from someone claiming to be of Native ancestry. But I never got a name of any of these people, and I never got a name of a tribe or a formal legend about why the place was supposed to be cursed, who cursed it, or why. All I know for certain is that people moved onto that block, experienced strange and horrifying invasions of their privacy by beings they couldn't understand, and then they moved out, except for this one poor soul. I figure the area must not have been haunted by these paranormal dogmen while the houses were being built, or they would never have been finished. I think that whatever happened in that area might have to do with the UFO flap more than it had to do with ancient history or folklore. I never did find out for certain, though, as the flap ended, leaving more questions behind than answers.
I love TikTok! It's like Vine, only better! On Vine, we could only talk 6 seconds, but on TikTok, we can talk 15 seconds, which takes all the stress out of like having to condenserize what you want to say, because no matter how hard I tried to shorten my ideas, I found I was always getting cut off before.
In the description of this video, we've got a link to our new Scary Stories t-shirt. It's our classic skull logo, and it says Scary Stories underneath in the Kaiju Monster font. It comes in black and also black and other dark colors such as black. Good for ladies or gentlemen, hoodies too, whatever you need. Oh, I also should plug the new Those American Girls album. It's got Madeline Starr on it and Patricia Howdigi and Colleen Great, and all the songs are written by Those American Girls. This one has no cover tracks on it. The title is Those American Girls Turn Off the TV, and you can get it from the link or links in the description.